The wind in the Montana high country did not whisper. It screamed like something hungry and alive. It clawed at Clara Barrow's cabin and tore at the loose fence posts as if trying to fib her last shelter from the earth. Clara fought it the way she had fought everything since her husband died. Alone. Her hands were cracked and bleeding as she tried to hammer a rail back into place. Snow swallowed her boots with every step. She was only 32, but grief and winter had carved hard lines into her face. The land had taken her cattle. It had taken her savings. It had taken Amos. And now it was trying to take the last 2 chickens that kept her alive. A sudden scream of feathers broke through the wind. Clara turned just in time to see a gaunt gray coyote dart from behind the coop with a hen in its jaws. She did not think. She grabbed the shotgun leaning by the cabin wall. The metal burned her hands with cold. The blast split the white silence. When the smoke cleared, the coyote lay still in the snow. Clara stood there, shaking. Not from fear, from anger. Everything out here was starving, even her. She carried the dead hen inside and barred the door tight. The cabin was small, rough wood, 1 cot, a narrow table, a stone hearth. It was the only place she felt safe. Then came the pounding. Not a knock. A heavy, dull strike against the door. Clara froze. No one came this far in winter. The shotgun was already in her hands. "Who's there?" she called. "Shelter!" The voice was low and rough. She wiped frost from the small window and looked out. He was huge, wrapped in thick furs crusted with ice, but he leaned against the doorframe like he might fall any second. Dark blood stained his shoulder. "Go away," she said flatly. "I've got nothing." "I'll trade," he rasped. He dropped his heavy pack into the snow and pulled out a bundle of skins. Thick, dark, perfect. 10, he said. Prime beaver, for the floor. 1 night. Clara stared at the pelts. 10 furs could buy flour, feed, powder. 10 furs could pay the debt Amos left behind. She looked at the man again. He was dying. Her stomach tightened. Amos had taught her what men could be. Loud, cruel, taking. But this man was swaying on his feet. "Just the floor," she said sharply. "You try anything, I shoot you." He nodded once. She unbarred the door. The wind slammed it open. He stumbled inside and collapsed near the hearth. He did not even look at her. No, he just curled toward the weak fire. Clara did not sleep that night. The stranger burned with fever. His breathing was harsh and broken. Near midnight, he began to mutter in his sleep. "Let him go," he whispered. "Not again." There was no anger in his voice, only guilt. Clara sat up on her cot, with the shotgun in her lap. She knew the sound of a violent man. Amos had cursed and shouted in his sleep. This was different. This was a man haunted. By dawn, his skin was burning hot. Clara stood over him and pressed her hand to his forehead. The wound on his shoulder smelled wrong, rotting. She could drag him outside and let the cold finish him. Take the pelts, survive. Instead, she melted snow, heated water, pulled out her sewing needles and the last of Amos's whiskey. "This will hurt," she said. But he woke screaming when the hot cloth touched his wound. His hand clamped around her wrist like iron. "You're infected," she said calmly. "Hold still or lose the arm." He stared at her through fevered gray eyes. Then slowly, he let go. She poured whiskey into the wound. He roared, but did not fight her. She dug the bullet out with a heated knife. Her hands never shook. When she finished stitching him up, she was the one trembling. He lived. 2 days later, he woke clear-eyed and pale. "You dug it out," he said. "It was festering," she replied. "Why?" "You paid for one night," she said. "The rest is interest." His name was Elias. He did not waste words. When he could stand, he began fixing her fence with one good arm. He repaired the south corner of the roof before she even asked. He chopped wood until he was gray with exhaustion. He never demanded, never bragged, never touched her. The silence in the cabin changed. It was no longer empty. One evening, she washed behind a hanging quilt for privacy. She saw his shadow through the firelight. He was sitting still, watching, but he did not move toward her, not once. Later, by the fire, he reached out and gently tucked a loose strand of her hair behind her ear. The touch was soft, careful. Her breath caught. She had not been touched like that in years. Fear rose sharp and cold. She pulled away. "Don't," she whispered. He nodded and stepped back. The next morning she broke. She confessed the truth about Amos, about the debt, about Silas Croft, who had tried to claim her along with the land. Elias listened without interrupting. "They'll come back," he said quietly. "Men like that always do." For the first time in years, Clara did not feel entirely alone when she looked at the storm outside her cabin. But storms always pass, and when they do, the world comes knocking. The storm did not last forever. When the snow finally stopped falling, the world outside Clara's cabin looked clean and quiet. But the quiet felt false, like something was waiting. Elias stood by the window, his rifle resting against his shoulder. His wound was healing, but he still moved with care. Clara could see the stiffness in his jaw when he worked. He never complained. "You should rest," she told him one morning. "I'll rest when it's done," he answered, hammering a new board into the fence. The sound of his work filled the valley. Thud, thud, thud. But it felt different than the noise Amos used to bring home. This sound built something. It did not break it. Days passed in a steady rhythm. Clara cooked what little food she had. Elias trapped rabbits along the tree line and patched the roof where the wind had chewed through the wood. They spoke little, but their silence was no longer heavy. It was shared. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Clara sat by the fire, brushing out her long brown hair. Elias watched the flames, but she could feel his eyes drift toward her. Not greedy, not cruel, just quiet. "You ever plan to leave this place?" he asked. She paused. "It's mine. Why would I leave?" He looked at her hands, rough and scarred from work. "Because men like Silas Croft don't forget." The name made her stomach twist. Silas Croft owned half the town in Three Forks, but he ran the land office, the bank, the saloon. He had tried to take her land after Amos died, tried to scare her into signing it over. "He won't scare me again," she said. Elias did not answer. He just stared into the fire. The knock came 3 days later. Clara stiffened. Elias moved without a sound, stepping to the side of the door, rifle ready. "Who is it?" Clara called. "Land office," a voice answered. "Inspection." Clara's blood ran cold. She opened the door just enough to see 2 men standing in the snow. They wore thin coats and smirks that made her skin crawl. "We're here on behalf of Mr. Croft," the taller one said. "He's filing abandonment papers. Says you ain't been improving the land." Clara felt the heat rise in her chest. "Look around. Fence is standing. Roof is fixed. Livestock's alive." The shorter man stepped inside without invitation, his boots dragging mud across her floor. His eyes moved over the cabin slowly. "Looks cozy," he said, "especially with company." Clara saw his gaze shift toward Elias's tools near the hearth. "You got a man staying here?" the tall one asked. "That against regulations, ma'am." "It's none of your concern," Clara said. The tall man smiled. "Everything's our concern." He took a step toward her. Before she could react, the shotgun was in her hands. She pressed the barrel into his chest so hard it bent his coat. "Get out," she said. Her voice did not shake. The men froze. Behind them, Elias stepped forward into the light. He did not raise the rifle. He did not speak. He just stood there, tall and silent, his gray eyes locked on them. The tall man swallowed. "This ain't over," he muttered. "It is for today," Clara replied. They backed out into the snow and rode away fast. Clara barred the door and leaned against it. Her hands were steady, but her heart pounded. Elias walked toward her slowly. "You did good," he said. She looked up at him. "I'm tired of being afraid." He reached out as if to touch her, then stopped halfway. She saw the hesitation, the respect. "You won't have to face him alone," he said quietly. Before she could answer, another sound rolled across the valley. Hooves, many of them. Elias moved to the window. His jaw tightened. "How many?" Clara whispered. 6, maybe 7. The riders came into view through the trees. At their front rode a broad-shouldered man in a dark coat. Even from a distance, Clara recognized him. Silas Croft. He did not ride alone, but he brought hired guns. They fanned out around the cabin like wolves, circling a wounded deer. Croft stopped his horse 10 yards from the door. "Mrs. Barrow," he called, his voice smooth and loud. "You've been avoiding lawful business." Clara stepped forward, shotgun in hand. "This is my land," she shouted back. Croft smiled slowly. "You owe 3 years of taxes, $40. Pay today, or I take possession." Clara felt the truth of it like a knife. She did not have $40. Elias stepped beside her now, rifle lifted. Croft's eyes narrowed. "Well," he said softly. "Now that's interesting." Recognition flickered across his face. "You're harboring a wanted man, Mrs. Barrow," Croft said. "Wyoming sheriff put a price on his head." Clara's heart slammed in her chest. She looked at Elias. He did not look at her, but he looked at Croft. "You ride off my land," Elias said calmly, "or I start shooting." The hired guns shifted nervously. Croft studied them both. "This ain't finished," he said finally. "You've got 48 hours." He turned his horse. The riders pulled away, snow kicking up behind them. The silence after they left felt heavier than the storm. Clara lowered the shotgun slowly. "You're wanted," she said. Elias nodded once. "For murder," he added. She stared at him. He met her eyes, and for the first time, she saw the full weight of his past there. "They'll come back," he said. "And next time, they won't talk." Clara tightened her grip on the shotgun. "Then we don't run," she answered. "We stand." The wind picked up again, whispering against the cabin walls. The battle for the land had begun. Out the 48 hours passed slowly. Clara did not sleep. Neither did Elias. They worked through the night, reinforcing the door with extra planks and dragging heavy logs against the weakest walls. Elias showed her how to reload faster, how to aim low in the snow, how to listen for movement beyond the wind. "This cabin ain't much," he said quietly, checking the rifle one last time. "But it'll hold long enough." "For what?" Clara asked. "For them to regret coming." Dawn came gray and bitter cold. The riders returned just after sunrise. This time they did not stop 10 yards away. They spread wide across the open field, rifles in hand. Croft sat tall in his saddle, like he already owned the land. "Last chance!" he shouted. $40 or you're out." Clara stepped onto the porch, shotgun resting against her shoulder. You'll have to drag me," she said. Croft's eyes hardened. "So be it." The first shot came from one of the hired guns. The bullet tore through the side of the cabin, splintering wood inches from Clara's head. Elias fired back instantly. The crack of his rifle split the morning air. One of the riders dropped from his horse into the snow. The field exploded into chaos. Gunfire tore through the quiet valley. Smoke rose in sharp bursts. Horses screamed. Clara ducked back inside as bullets punched through the walls. Elias moved beside her, calm and deadly, firing through the shattered window. "Reload!" he barked. She did. Her hands moved without thinking now. Fear had burned away. What remained was something harder. One of Croft's men rushed toward the door with a torch. Clara stepped forward and fired. At the blast threw the man backward into the snow, the torch rolling uselessly away. Croft shouted curses. Elias aimed again, but then his body jerked. Clara saw the blood bloom dark against his thigh. "No!" she gasped. He staggered, but did not fall. "I'm fine," he growled through clenched teeth. "Keep shooting." She dragged him behind the stone hearth as more bullets ripped through the wood. The cabin groaned under the assault. "They'll burn it," Elias said, pressing his hand against his bleeding leg. Clara's eyes moved quickly. She remembered the shed behind the cabin, the dry hay, the old oil can. "I'll smoke them out," she whispered. "Clara, no." But she was already moving. She slipped out the back pantry door and ran low through the snow. Bullets snapped past her, close enough to sting the air. She reached the shed, splashed oil over the hay, and struck a match. The fire caught fast. Thick black smoke rolled across the field, carried by the rising wind straight into Croft's men. They coughed and shouted, blind in the haze. Inside the cabin, Elias pushed himself back to the window and fired into the smoke. Another rider fell. Boone, the tall man from before, stumbled forward, gun raised. Elias steadied his aim. One shot. Boone dropped. The hired guns broke first. Two of them fled toward the trees. Croft tried to rally the rest, but panic had taken hold. Then, new riders appeared from the east. Clara heard the thunder of hooves and dared to look. Abner Potts rode at the front, rifle raised, his ranch hand spread behind him in a clean line. "That's enough!" Abner roared. He fired into the air, then aimed straight at Croft. But the field fell silent. Croft looked around and realized the numbers had turned against him. "You'll pay for this!" he shouted at Clara. Abner cocked his rifle. "Ride," he said coldly. Croft hesitated only a second before turning his horse and fleeing. The remaining men followed. The valley grew still again. Smoke drifted upward into the pale sky. Clara ran back inside. Elias had collapsed against the hearth. Blood soaked the floor. She dropped beside him, pressing her hands against the wound. "Stay with me," she whispered. Abner entered behind her and knelt. "He'll live," Abner said after a moment. "But we need to move fast." The hours that followed blurred together. They dug the bullet out. They stitched the wound. Clara did not cry. She worked. Elias drifted in and out of fever through the night. Just before dawn, and his eyes opened. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. "You stood," he murmured. "So did you," she replied. Weeks passed. The marshal from Helena arrived after Abner sent word. Croft was arrested for fraud and attempted murder. The hired guns scattered. Sheriff Barlow's warrant was challenged once the truth of his corruption came out. The land deed was placed into Clara's hands, clean and final. She stood outside the cabin one evening as Elias leaned against the repaired fence. "You could leave now," she said softly. "No one would chase you." He looked at the mountains, then back at her. "I offered 10 furs for one night," he said. She stepped closer. "And I gave you more," she answered. He nodded. "You gave me a reason to stop running." The wind moved gently through the valley now, not screaming, not clawing, just moving. Elias reached for her hand. This time, there was no hesitation. The land was still harsh. Winter would come again, but they would face it together. Not as a widow and a stranger, but as two people who had chosen to stand, and won.